Greetings and welcome to the Serial Talker podcast. I'm Peter von Gomm. In today's podcast, we're going to be talking about a murder mystery way back in the mid-1980s in rural Virginia. A couple was murdered brutally in their home. The suspects, their daughter, and their daughter's foreign boyfriend. There still remain a lot of unanswered questions, inconsistencies in the investigation, as well as redacted confessions. This is an incredible story. I hope you enjoy it. The door was locked, but the light outside was burning bright. And when the three women arrived for bridge with Mr. Haysom, they were puzzled to find no one answering the door. The cars were in the driveway. Though it was daytime, the porch light by the door had been left on. It was April 3rd, 1985. The women called Annie Massey, a friend who had a spare key in case something had befallen their bridge partner or his wife. Holcomb Rock Road, where Derek and Nancy Haysom lived, snaked through central Virginia and into the hilly, deep woods around Lynchburg. Derek, 72, was a South African engineer. He met Nancy, an American known as Sita, in Johannesburg when they were both divorced. They'd joined their families, and in 1964 they had their only child together, Elizabeth, raised in Nova Scotia, where Derek had a steel mill. The house on Holcomb Rock Road, which they'd bought a few years earlier for retirement, was modest, but it had a tennis court and a swimming pool and a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Nancy dubbed the place Loose Chippings, after a British phrase for scattered gravel on the road. When Massey entered the house, she found the Haysoms sprawled on the ground, caked in gore. Derek Haysom was on his side near a doorway, an arm outstretched before him. Nancy was in the kitchen, traced in crimson whorls, as if someone had wiped the blood around her like Windex on glass. Both bodies were ragged with stab wounds, and their necks had been cut nearly from ear to ear. Officers soon swarmed the scene. Loose Chippings had a Lynchburg mailing address, but sat in Bedford County outside town. Though the crimes were in the jurisdiction of the county sheriff's office, a task force from Central Virginia joined the case. Chuck Reed and Ricky Gardner, investigators from Bedford, set out to discover what the neighbors knew. Gardner, then 29, had never worked a homicide before. The house revealed no indication of forced entry. On the dining room table were place settings and the remnants of a meal. No weapon could be found, but there were footprints in the blood. One looked to have been made by a tennis shoe, and two more by socks. Forensic study showed that the Haysoms had blood alcohol levels of .22, exceedingly high. A vodka bottle nearby carried fingerprints, as did a shot glass. 4 blood types were in evidence. The Haysoms A and AB, a bit of B blood on a damp rag, and on the screen door and in the master suite, spots of O. DNA analysis was largely unavailable in 1985, but from these samples, it was possible to reconstruct a sequence of events. At some point between March 29th and the 31st, the killer or killers had arrived at Loose Chippings, probably during the meal. Someone, it seemed, had sat down at the table with the Haysoms to eat. A trail of blood suggested that Derek was attacked there and stumbled across the dining room as he bled. A bloody palm print on a side chair showed where he'd put a hand down, as if struggling to stay upright. His killer had pursued him. Derek Haysom's jugular and carotid artery were cut, and he had been stabbed 36 times. Then the murderer, with great presence of mind, seemed to have gotten up, wiped down much of the scene, and washed up in the bathroom. By the time Elizabeth Haysom started as a freshman at the University of Virginia in the late summer of 1984, she was 20, 2 years older than most of her classmates. In her final year at Wycombe Abbey, a boarding school outside London, she had botched her interview for Trinity College, Cambridge, blown off her classes, then ran away with a female lover to travel through Europe, sometimes high on drugs. Living with her parents on return, feeling that her life had reached an early end, she'd got into UVA as an elite école scholar. It wasn't exactly the fairy tale she had in mind. At an orientation event, she met Jens Soring. He was a German student, born in Thailand and educated largely in the American South. He had horn-rimmed glasses, Mick Jagger lips, and a priggish haughtiness of manner. That evening, he struggled to make sense of Haysom. She wore her dirty blonde hair short. He had assessing gray eyes. Around campus, she smoked with the cool effortlessness, like a movie star. She talked like Soring, with an unplaceable Britishish accent. They were different, though. In high school, in Atlanta, Soring had edited the school newspaper, done photography, acted on stage, played guitar in garage bands, won art awards, and had taken many AP classes. His father, a bureaucrat with the German consular service, had recently transferred from Atlanta to Detroit. Soring's achievements were part of a plan to meet the admissions requirements of German universities, but he had been accepted at UVA as a Jefferson Scholar, an elite within the elite, and given a full scholarship and spending money. He rarely saw Haysom as the weeks progressed. They moved in separate worlds. Then, one night in October, they found themselves together at a movie screening. By November, they were meeting in the Treehouse, a campus snack bar. Haysom felt herself falling for Soring. She liked his Middle European aloofness, his rock band past, and his ambition. She saw him as a tortured artist. Once in the Treehouse, he joked that they had started prattling on together like an old married couple. Haysom took what seemed to be her cue, and she confessed her love for him. In December, she left a letter in his room. I hated my love for you for a long time. I hated myself for discovering vulnerability. But as the weeks passed, I began to understand. I had always believed that I made men fall in love with me so I could take out all the hatred I felt for them by humiliating them. I despised their cheap lust and easy passions. With Soring, she explained, it wasn't like that. With you, I love you, with a part of me that no one else will ever come close to. Charlottesville in autumn was a restive and romantic place. Soring had a ground-floor dorm room facing the Slaughter Recreation Center. Haysom had a room on a higher floor. The two were together until winter break pulled them apart, sending Haysom to loose chippings with her parents, and Soring to Detroit with his. Home depressed him. He'd never really lived in Michigan. His father, Klaus, had a temper, and his mother was an alcoholic, prone to moods and sadness. Haysom, too, was going crazy at home. One of her half-brothers described their father as a parent from a previous generation, publicly gregarious, privately reserved, authoritarian, and Haysom had a troubled relationship with her mother. During the winter break, Haysom wrote Soring letters. A day of reigning loneliness. This morning I built my father a desk for his computer. It took all morning. I didn't smoke. Then I went shopping. I bought cigarettes. I bought other things too. My father fell down. I prayed. He got up. My parents began to drink. My father says that the juniper extract used to flavor gin is a potent poison drug. It causes similar aggression as speed. Mom starts gin number 6. I'm praying she'll use the poker on my cold, guiding father. Soring, in his letters, tried to channel Haysom's antic stream of consciousness, but he had a more starched and pressed mind. Were I to meet your parents, I have the ultimate weapon. Strange things are happening within me. I'm turning more and more into a Christ figure. A small imitation, anyway. I believe I could either make them completely lose their wits, get heart attacks, or they would become lovers, in an agape kind of way, of the rest of the world. In January, he went back to Charlottesville with a buoyant sense of escape. During the next few weeks, he and Haysom visited loose chippings when her parents weren't home. One evening at UVA, Soring says, He returned from the library to find Haysom alone in bed, hugging her knees. On the inside of her elbow was a small needle mark. Heroin. A friend of her dealer had come by and, well, she was so sorry for using. That winter, the Haysoms came to Charlottesville to take the young couple to lunch. They grilled Soaring about his family and his past. When the Haysoms hosted a niece of Derek's a week or so later, they were still talking about the weirdness of the meal. They worried that Soaring had insufficient standing for their daughter. Nancy Haysom found him oddly jumpy at the table, too. During spring break, Haysom went skiing in Colorado. Soaring stayed in Charlottesville to finish some school projects. One was a screenplay for his creative writing class, and he acted the way he thought writers should. He perched at the typewriter in his underwear, eating pizza. He tried to smoke a cigarette. His screenplay was about a brilliant sleuth who used Zen philosophy to solve crimes, and as he typed scenes about corpses, clues, and exotic poisons, he filled the wastepaper basket with discarded drafts. He was trying to plot the perfect murder. From Haysom's winter correspondence to Soaring. My mother went to her hair appointment 3 days late. My father and I cut down cedars for Christmas presents. Would it be possible to hypnotize my parents, do voodoo on them, will them to death? It seems my concentration on their death is causing them problems. My father nearly drove off a cliff at lunch. He nearly got squashed by a tree when he got home, and he keeps falling over. And my mother, drunk, fell into the fire. I'm seriously thinking of taking up black magic. We can either wait till we graduate and then leave them behind, or we can get rid of them soon. My mother said today that if some accident befell them, she knew I would become a worthless adventurer. More maternal acumen. On the afternoon of Friday, March 29th, 1985, Haysom and Soaring rented a gray Chevette and drove to Washington, D.C., where they used his father's Visa card to book a room at the Georgetown Marriott. After checking in, they went to see the movie Porky's Revenge. They spent Saturday midday wandering around the neighborhood, then went for a late lunch at a restaurant with a train theme. On Sunday, they drove back to Charlottesville. Haysom was notified of her parents' murders on Wednesday when the bodies were discovered. What later interested investigators was the odometer on the Chevette. According to rental records, the car had been driven 669 miles between its rental and its return, some 400 miles more than a trip to and from Washington, D.C. This was the distance from Charlottesville to Washington, Washington to Loose Chippings, and back along the same route. A suspect profile from the FBI had identified the murderer as a female who knew the family. For a time, suspicion fell on the daughter of a local judge, whose engagement to Haysom's older half-brother Julian had ended, supposedly under pressure from his parents. Julian says that his parents were actually disappointed by the end of the engagement. A few weeks before the murders, the girl had brought knives to a friend and asked him to take them because evil spirits were pursuing her. Chuck Reed from the Homicide Task Force thought that the woman was skittish, but not a killer, and she had told him an unsettling story. At one point, she said, Elizabeth Haysom had approached her. "I'm the devil," Haysom had told her. "You're the sacrificial lamb." On Monday, April 8th, Reed and another investigator sat down with Haysom at an elementary school where they had set up a field station. Gardner was struck by Haysom's accent. She told him that she'd been dating a German guy and that they'd rented a car to spend the weekend in D.C. The investigators sent her home, but called her back later to ask about the extra miles on the Chevette. She said that she and Soaring had gotten lost on the drive. In June, Soaring and Haysom flew to Europe for a vacation. They returned to UVA for summer school, where their romance bloomed. When school started again in the fall, Soaring effectively moved into the house where Haysom lived with roommates and a cat named Snark. On October 6th, he drove to the Bedford County Sheriff's Office to speak with the investigators. They asked for his fingerprints, footprints, and blood to help eliminate him as a suspect. Haysom had given hers. Soring balked. He told them that he'd have to clear the request with the German embassy. Investigator Gardner was feeling pressure from the Haysom family, especially from Elizabeth's half-brother, Howard Haysom, a doctor in Houston, who was due to visit Lynchburg on October 15th. 6 days before the visit, Soring phoned Gardner to say that he was busy with schoolwork, but that he could meet in a week to give his blood and prints. On the night of Howard Haysom's arrival, Gardner was working late in the field when the sheriff's office patched through an urgent call. It was Howard, livid. Elizabeth and Soring had vanished. When the investigators got to Charlottesville, Haysom's roommate handed them a letter from Soring. Dear Officers Reed and Gardner, I assume that especially you, Mr. Gardner, will be very excited by now, which is why I hate to disappoint you. Well, that's not exactly true. I suggest that you continue your investigation as before. Undoubtedly, you will find whom you are looking for. As for me, I am afraid you must remain, as Officer Reed put it, only 99% sure of my innocence. From what Liz has told me of what you discovered at Loose Chippings, I can only say that I am incapable of such a thing. I do not have many friends, but I think they will substantiate this and my long-standing dissatisfaction with my life here. By the time Gardner got back to his office, Soring had become his leading suspect. Haysom and Soring followed separate itineraries and rendezvoused that Tuesday in Paris under the Arc de Triomphe. Haysom had dyed her hair bright red. From there they traveled to the tiny city of Edelbruck in Luxembourg. The plan was to go to Thailand, locate Soring's birth certificate, marry, and apply jointly for Thai passports. They rented a Fiat, planning to drive through France, Switzerland, Italy, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Turkey, and onward. It didn't work. At the Bulgarian border, they were told that they would need to get a visa at the Bulgarian embassy in Belgrade. As Haysom turned the car around, a driver traveling in the opposite direction pulled into their lane. She swerved into the shoulder where the Fiat blew a tire and careened back through the oncoming traffic. Soring briefly lost consciousness in the crash. Following an appearance in the local traffic court, they decided to fly the rest of the way. Bangkok was hot and bustling. Haysom loathed it, but Soring was enchanted. The city had an air of cosmopolitanism. Everyone there seemed to work a shady sideline, and he glided toward the underworld. He bought books about British banking. He and Haysom visited Bangkok's crooked printing shops to obtain false papers modeled on hers, Canadian driver's licenses, citizenship certificates, and certified passport copies. They had 3 sets of photos made, rearranging their hair between each set so that the headshots would seem to have been taken at different times. As the year drew to a close, they took a 1,000-mile bus trip from Bangkok to Singapore and then flew to Moscow, spending New Year's Eve drinking vodka. From there, they made their way to Canterbury, where they assumed false identities as Tim and Julia Holt, 2 married Canadian students at the University of Kent. The Holts went to the local branch of Lloyd's to open bank accounts. They wanted check guarantee cards, special bank IDs then widely used in England, whereby Lloyd's would honor bounced checks of up to £50. Because the Holts had made only a small deposit, they were given a 4 to 6 week probationary period, during which they had to maintain a certain balance. To wait it out, Haysom and Soring rented a room with a local family. Soring kept the pair vigilant. They used each other's aliases, even when having sex. Tim, Julia, in case the sounds happened to carry. When their check guarantee cards came, they went to London. Starting on Monday, February 24th, 1986, they spent 10 hours a day touring the city's Mark & Spencer branches, executing a con around a leather jacket that cost £49. One of them would enter the store and buy the jacket with a Lloyd's guaranteed Holt check. The other, entering later, would return a jacket previously purchased at another M&S in exchange for cash. The checks would bounce, but M&S would get its money, and Lloyd's had a policy of not reporting frauds of less than £10,000. Checks accepted on Monday took until Friday to clear. When Haysom and Soring started, they had 120 Holt checks. By the time the first check bounced, they had spent and cash redeemed all of them, a profit of £6,000. With a deposit that size, they could get check guarantee cards with no waiting period. They went to Bath and opened accounts at Midland Bank under the names Tara Lucy No and Christopher Platt No. Their new checkbooks came in days, and they rented a flat on Baker Street. As the Holts, they avoided being in the same Mark and Spencer's at the same time. This time, Haysom suggested they enter together, but stay apart. At the last Mark and Spencer's they visited on April 30th, a store employee noticed them and grew suspicious. She followed them onto the street and flagged them for a plainclothes officer. Chuck Reed quit the police force that spring to support his family with a better-paying job at a freight company. Ricky Gardner was now alone on the case. On Thursday, May 29, 1986, more than a year after the murders, Gardner got a call from London. Detective Constable Terry Wright of the Metropolitan Police wanted to know whether he was acquainted with Elizabeth Haysom or Jens Soring. Wright explained that they were in custody in Richmond in southwest London. Perhaps Gardner would like to meet with them. Gardner flew to London 4 days later with James Updike, Bedford County's prosecutor. They didn't have a warrant, but a magistrate ruled they could interview the suspects over the weekend. If they failed to find what they were looking for, they would have to return home, and the fraud charges against Haysom and Soring would proceed. Soring had no lawyer present for these interviews. He was given solicitor waiver forms, and he signed them. He says that he did so because Wright's colleague had threatened to harm Haysom unless he talked. Soring insists that he repeatedly asked for a lawyer and says he was asked whether he would plead guilty to something he didn't do, to which Soring responded, "I can't say for sure right now, but I can see it happening, yes. I think it is a possibility. I think it happens in real life." Late on Sunday, Soring asked to speak with the investigators without a tape recorder. This time he told a very different story of what had happened in March of 1985. While driving to Washington, D.C., Soring said, he and Haysom had talked about the problem of her parents. They objected to her dating him. The idea of killing them, mentioned in the winter letters, rose again. Yet Soring had thought that he could talk things through with them, and on Saturday night he'd driven to Loose Chippings alone. Haysom stayed in Georgetown where, to create an alibi in case one proved necessary, she bought a pair of tickets to several evening movies. Derek Haysom had answered the door at Loose Chippings and served Soring a drink or two. He and the Haysoms sat at the table together, Soring with his back to the window, Derek Haysom to his left. The Haysoms were drinking, and they began to argue. They threatened to have Soring expelled from UVA if he kept seeing their daughter. Soring got up to leave. As he rose, Derek Haysom slammed him against the wall, where he hit his head. Soring grabbed a knife and swung at Haysom's neck, opening a vein. Nancy Haysom came at him with a knife of her own. Soring wrestled it away from her, grabbed her, and began using her as a shield against Derek Haysom, who was flailing at him with a spoon. Soring slashed Nancy Haysom in the neck too, then let go of her. He'd lost his glasses in the struggle. Derek Haysom struck him again in the head. The next thing Soring recalled was tossing tableware, his clothes, and the two knives into a dumpster at the end of the road. He hadn't noticed until then that he had cut his hand. He went back to the house in his socks to wipe away fingerprints and blood. He swirled the stains around Nancy Haysom to obscure his footprints. He washed his hand and bound a towel around it. Then he wrapped himself in a sheet, turned out the lights, and went back to Georgetown to meet Elizabeth after her attending the Rocky Horror Picture Show. At the end of Soring's explanation, Gardner left the room to get the other investigators. Soring repeated his account for them, too. He showed some scars on his fingers, which he said had come from the struggle. On June 13th, a grand jury convened by the Circuit Court of Bedford County indicted Soring, who remained in custody in England for the murders. Both Haysom and Soring underwent psychological evaluations. Haysom's diagnosis was borderline personality disorder, a condition of unstable identity and impulse control. Soring was given a diagnosis of shared delusional disorder. In October, Haysom wrote what amounted to be a Dear John letter to Soring. She was going to plead guilty. The following May, she was extradited to Virginia, and her story during a 3-day hearing seemed to match Soring's confession broadly. She was sentenced to 90 years in prison as an accessory before the fact. During one of Gardner's talks with Haysom, she had described, in chilling precision, the exterior of Gardner's house. She knew what it looked like, she said, because Soring had followed Gardner home after their interview, wanting to kill him. By the terms of the 1961 Vienna Convention, some privileges, including immunity from most criminal and civil prosecution, are extended to a diplomat's household. When Soring confessed, he believed that he had such immunity. If he were extradited to Germany, he would probably be tried as a minor and sentenced to a maximum of 10 years, with parole likely in 5. Yet, shortly after receiving Haysom's letter, Soring learned that the United States granted such immunity only to employees at Washington, D.C. embassies. If Soring were extradited to Virginia, he would be tried for capital murder. Soring recanted his confession. He had not killed the Haysoms, he said. Haysom had, and he had taken the blame. Soring's version of the events were detailed in a memoir penned later. During the Saturday lunch at the train-themed restaurant, Soring says, Haysom confessed that she was using heroin again. As a result, she owed money to her dealer. To pay the debt, she had arranged to pick up a drug shipment in D.C. and bring it back to UVA. If she didn't go through with the plan, her dealer would tell her parents about her drug use. Soring says that she asked him to buy a pair of tickets to 2 movies, Witness and Stranger Than Paradise, to establish an alibi for her drug run. He also says that he bought a single ticket to the midnight showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. He says that he got annoyed when she didn't return on time and decided to see the movie on his own. When Haysom finally returned to the hotel, he says, he'd ordered room service and was watching TV. Her forearms bore red-brown smears. She said that she'd killed her parents, drugs had made her do it. Soring says that she pleaded with him to use the movie ticket alibi to cover her. Haysom denies this entire account. Soring explains that, as his mind raced across what he knew from books and movies, it alighted on Sidney Carton of A Tale of Two Cities. He decided that he would take the blame to save her from the gallows. On June 21st, Soring was found guilty of the murders of Derek and Nancy Haysom. The jury issued the maximum punishment available, life in prison, for each death. Yet some aspects of the murder were still unexplained. If Soring had killed the Haysoms alone, who had made the tennis shoe print in blood, a mark smaller than Soring's foot? Who had left type B blood? Who was responsible for the unidentified fingerprints? Soring had misremembered the position of Derek Haysom's body and the clothes that Nancy Haysom had worn, among other things. Inconsistencies are not disproof. Memory is notoriously unreliable. It is also possible that Soring's errors were deliberate, an attempt to avoid conviction. Still, the evidence could have supported different conclusions. The crimes of which Haysom and Soring were convicted, it has become increasingly probable, weren't the murders that occurred. While Soring could have killed Derek and Nancy Haysom alone, as he confessed, it would have been impossible for him to leave prints smaller than his foot in the blood. It is likewise hard to imagine Haysom single-handedly knife-murdering 2 adults, one of them a large man. Were the verdicts, even if arrived at through selective evidence and legal error, actually unjust? Could Soring and Haysom have operated as a team? Nobody is known to have seen either of them in Georgetown on that Saturday night. The murders, for that matter, may not have taken place on Saturday evening at all. Forensic analysts speak of a window of death the period from the last time the victim was known to be alive to the latest moment when biological indicators would allow death to have occurred. The window for the Haysoms comprised the entire weekend, and Haysom and Soring's movements during that period were in large part unconfirmed. Soring could have planned to confess to the crime to protect Haysom. If he was convicted, he would get a few years' imprisonment in Germany, after which he and Haysom could reunite. The plan would have collapsed when Soring learned that he didn't have diplomatic immunity and Haysom broke off their relationship. They'd accuse each other because the truth would implicate them both more deeply. His cover-up would have had a troublesomely literary quality, its contours taken from Dickens, the Bible, and Hollywood cliché. The drug run, the last job, and I'm out. The femme fatale, I've got myself in a real bad fix. Because he is a researcher, he draws on texts. Haysom's version would have a fantastical air, because that was how her own mind worked. Loose clippings would be a tale about two storytellers who aroused each other's imaginations and composed a vast creative project, not on paper, but in life. Naturally, nothing specifically supports this story. Unlike the convicting narrative, it could explain the tennis shoe print, but the question of motive remains elusive. Haysom and a jury said that Soring brutally murdered two people to please a dormitory girlfriend he had barely started seeing in earnest. Soring says that on learning that his new girlfriend had butchered her parents in a fit of rage, kept on dating her and, in fact, took her on a lovely holiday to his homeland. Or it may be that they killed together. None of these scenarios seem plausible. One seems to have occurred. The thin vein running through them all is belief, a young man embracing a wildly romantic story and striving to live within it. So, who did it? He said she did it. She said he did it. Maybe they did it together? One thing's for sure, there were no winners. As an update to this story, on November 25th last year, after rejecting 14 parole requests from Soring and from Haysom, they both were granted parole simultaneously. He deported to his native Germany and she to Canada. Soring was 19 when he was incarcerated, now he's 53, and part of the condition of his parole is he is forbidden from returning to the U.S. or having any contact whatsoever with Elizabeth Haysom or her family. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Serial Talker podcast. If you like these kinds of podcasts, by all means, please consider subscribing. If you would like to support the podcast, you could always buy me a cup of coffee. Those details are in the description. And why not share it on your social media? If you know somebody who you think might like these podcasts, please pass it on. And if you have a compelling true story that you would like me to consider reading, please send me an email. That information is also in the description. Thanks so much, guys. We'll see you very soon. Ciao.